The morning Stephen Easton rode into Redemption Creek, Texas. He carried nothing but a saddlebag, a worn leather Bible, and a rumor that had already traveled 50 miles ahead of him like smoke on a dry wind. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek sat stubborn and sun-bleached along the banks of a narrow tributary that fed into the Colorado River. The main street was packed dirt and ambition, lined with a general store, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a livery stable, a small church painted white though the paint peeled like sunburned skin, and a boarding house where traveling men slept two to a bed and paid 4 bits for the privilege. The town had a sheriff named Walt Greer who wore his badge like a crown, and a doctor named Clarence Peel who drank more than he healed. It was the kind of place that believed itself more important than it was, and it treated its inhabitants accordingly. Stephen was 29 years old and broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled at his collar from the trail dust and sweat of 3 weeks of riding. He had come from San Antonio, where he had sold the small cattle operation his late father had left him at a loss just to settle the debts and walk away with something close to dignity. He had his father's straight jaw and his mother's careful eyes, the kind of eyes that watched before they judged. He was not a man who spoke much, but when he did, people tended to listen. He had heard about Redemption Creek from a man named Corbin Hale at a roadside inn outside of Kerrville, who had pressed a glass of whiskey on him and said, with the particular pleasure of a man delivering bad news, that there was cheap land to be had near Redemption Creek. Good grazing land, river access, and a homestead already partially built by a family that had given up and moved east after a drought. It was exactly what Stephen needed, a place to start again. A place where the name Easton meant nothing yet, which meant it could come to mean something earned rather than something inherited and lost. What Corbin Hale had also said, with that same whiskey-warmed cheerfulness, was that there was a woman in Redemption Creek that the whole town had given up on. Ella Hawkins, widow of Thomas Hawkins who had died of a fever 2 winters past, left behind on a small piece of land with a house and a mule and not much else. The town had tried to help her, or so Corbin said, but she was stubborn and proud and would not take charity. The real problem, Corbin said, leaning in close as though sharing a great confidence, was that she was barren. Every person in Redemption Creek knew it. Her first husband had said so himself before he died, told it to Doc Peel, who had told it to his wife, who had told it to the rest. No man would have her, and that was the plain truth of it. Broken, Corbin called her, with a shrug that suggested it was simply a fact of the world, like bad weather or poor soil. Stephen had said nothing to that. He had drunk his whiskey, thanked Corbin Hale for the information about the land, paid his portion of the bill and ridden on. But the name had stayed with him. Ella Hawkins. He did not know why. He was not a man given to romantic notions. He had been briefly engaged once, to a woman in San Antonio named Clara Reeves, but she had broken it off when the cattle operation began to fail, which told him something important about Clara Reeves and about himself, which was that he had chosen poorly and that he should choose more carefully next time. He was not bitter about it. He simply filed it away as information. When he arrived in Redemption Creek on that bright April morning, he tied his horse, a sturdy roan gelding he called Marshall, outside the general store and went in to ask about the land he had heard about. The man behind the counter was wide and red-faced and introduced himself as Gus Whatley, owner of Whatley's General Store, and as he mentioned 3 times in the first 2 minutes, the acting treasurer of the town council. Gus confirmed that, yes, the Braddock homestead was available. The family had surrendered the claim, and with some paperwork filed at the land office in Marble Falls, it could be Stephen's. Good land, river access. The house needed work, but the bones were solid. Stephen bought a sack of dried beans, a tin of coffee, and a box of ammunition for his Winchester while Gus talked. And Gus talked the way some men did when they had been waiting for a new audience. He talked about the town's plans for expansion, about the new school they hoped to build, about the recent cattle drive that had passed through and left money in its wake like a river leaving mud. And then, because it seemed the way of the town, he mentioned Ella Hawkins. "You will want to know your neighbors," Gus said, wrapping Stephen's purchases in brown paper. "The Braddock place sits about a mile east of the Hawkins widow's land. Nice enough woman, I suppose, though she has had her troubles. Lost her husband 2 winters back. No family nearby. No prospects, if you take my meaning." He paused, eyebrows raised as though inviting Stephen to take his meaning very much. "I take it you mean she is unmarried," Stephen said. "Unmarried and like to stay that way." Gus lowered his voice as though delivering a verdict. "Doc Peel says she cannot have children. Thomas Hawkins told him so before he passed. Said they tried for 3 years and nothing came of it. A man needs children, you understand. Heirs. Someone to leave things to. A woman who cannot provide that well." He shrugged in the exact same way Corbin Hale had shrugged, that particular gesture of a man declaring something beyond his control or concern. Stephen picked up his brown paper package. "What does she think of that?" he asked. Gus blinked. "Beg pardon?" "The widow Hawkins. What does she think of that assessment?" Gus seemed to find the question genuinely confusing, as though the opinion of the woman in question had never entered the conversation before, which it clearly had not. "I expect she knows it to be true," he said finally. Stephen nodded once, thanked him, and walked out into the April sunshine. He spent that first day riding out to look at the Braddock homestead, and it was as good as advertised. The house was a 2-room structure of rough-hewn timber and plank, solidly built despite years of neglect, with a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft and a covered porch that faced east toward the river. The land itself rolled in easy waves of short grass, already greening from spring rains, and a fence line of split cedar posts marked 3 sides of the property. It needed fences repaired and the house needed work, but standing in the doorway of that weathered structure and looking out at the land, Stephen felt the first genuine hope he had experienced in over a year. He rode back to town at dusk and took a room at the boarding house, a place run by a woman named Mabel Creed, who was somewhere between 50 and ancient, and who served supper at 6 o'clock exactly and tolerated no exceptions. He sat at the long common table with 4 other men, 2 of whom were passing through and 2 of whom were permanent residents waiting for their own fortunes to clarify themselves. He ate salt pork and cornbread and listened more than he spoke, which was his way. It was over that supper that he first heard Ella Hawkins speak, or rather heard of her speaking, through the report of one of the permanent residents, a thin man named Earl Duggan who worked at the livery stable and seemed to consider the reporting of other people's business a secondary occupation. "The widow Hawkins came into town today," Earl said, helping himself to a second portion of cornbread. "Bought herself a new hoe at Gus Whatley's store and told Gus that if he extended her credit 1 more month she would have the full amount by harvest. Bold as brass she was, walked in there like she owned the place." "Does she farm alone?" Stephen asked. Earl looked at him with the evaluating squint of a man deciding whether a new person was worth informing. "All by herself. Has a kitchen garden and a small corn patch and raises some chickens. Trades eggs in town. Gets by, I suppose, though it is no life for a woman without a husband." He shook his head with that particular melancholy men use when discussing women's struggles that they feel no obligation to solve. "Course no man will have her given her condition." "Her condition," Stephen repeated, keeping his voice neutral. "She is barren," Earl said, as plainly as one might report the weather. "Everyone knows it." Stephen set down his fork. "Has anyone asked her about it?" A brief silence settled over the table. The 2 passing through men looked at their plates. Mabel Creed, appearing from the kitchen doorway with a fresh pot of coffee, gave Stephen a look that was not unfriendly. "It is not the sort of thing you ask a lady," Earl said, with the dignity of a man who had never once considered asking. "No," Stephen agreed quietly. "I suppose it is not." He lay awake that night in the narrow boarding-house bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the town settle into darkness. The cicadas were beginning their season outside the window, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and was answered. He thought about the Braddock homestead and the work it would take to make it productive. He thought about his father's face, weathered and resolute, and about how the old man had built something from nothing once and lost it to drought and debt, and how Stephen had inherited both the loss and the obligation to try again. And he thought about Ella Hawkins, who walked into the general store bold as brass and arranged her own credit and farmed her land alone, and was spoken of by every man in town as though she were a problem to be categorized rather than a person to be known. He decided he would go introduce himself in the morning. He did not go in the morning, because the morning brought the need to ride to Marble Falls to file his land claim at the county office, a day's ride there, and most of a day back. He was on the road before the sun was fully up, and he pushed Marshall hard along the river trail and arrived in Marble Falls by midday, and spent 3 hours with a clerk who had the deliberate pace of a man who had never been in a hurry in his life. The paperwork was filed, the fee paid, the receipt folded into Stephen's breast pocket. He was the legal homesteader of the Braddock claim as of the 15th of April, 1878. He rode back under a sky turning amber and pink, arriving in Redemption Creek as the last light was draining out of the west. As he passed the edge of town, he saw a light burning in a small farmhouse set back from the road on the east side, and an instinct told him it was hers. There was a kitchen garden visible even in the fading light, precisely kept, with young corn barely showing above the turned earth. A chicken coop ran along the south side of the house, and there was a small barn that had seen better decades. The house itself was modest but cared for, with a new-looking board nailed over what appeared to have been a broken shutter, the wood still pale and fresh against the weathered gray of the rest. He did not stop. It was late, and he was road-worn, and he was not the sort of man to present himself at a woman's door after dark uninvited. He rode on to the boarding house and ate the cold supper Mabel Creed had left covered on the kitchen table, because she tolerated no exceptions, but she was not without compassion. He went to her homestead the next morning. He rode up the road and turned in at the track that led to her door, and before he was halfway up the track she was already standing on the porch watching him come. She had not heard Marshall's approach so much as sensed it, he thought, or perhaps she watched the road often, being alone. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was somewhere around 26 or 27, he guessed, with dark auburn hair pinned up but escaping in pieces around her face from the morning work. She was lean in the way of people who work hard and eat what they can raise, but there was nothing diminished about her. She held herself straight, her chin at a particular angle that he recognized as the posture of someone who has learned to meet the world without flinching. She wore a plain calico dress in faded blue and a canvas apron, and she had a garden hoe in one hand, which she was not using as a weapon but which she was clearly prepared to use as something if necessary. "Morning," he said, pulling Marshall to a stop a respectful distance from the porch steps. "My name is Stephen Easton. I have just taken the Braddock claim to the east of you, and I thought I ought to come introduce myself to my neighbor." She studied him with a directness that most women in 1878 Texas were taught to avoid. "I heard someone bought that claim," she said. Her voice was low and even, not unfriendly but not offering anything for free. "I am Ella Hawkins." "I know," he said. "Gus Whatley was kind enough to introduce me to the whole town in about 15 minutes. Something shifted in her expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "Gus Whatley considers himself the town's official newspaper," she said. "He does a thorough job of it," Stephen said. The almost smile settled into something real for a moment, brief and private, and then she put it away. "What can I do for you, Mr. Easton?" "Nothing at all," he said. "I only wanted to say that I am nearby if you ever need a hand with something, and that I hope to be a decent neighbor." She regarded him with the particular wariness of a woman who has learned that offers of help often come with costs attached. "I manage my own land," she said. "I can see that," he said, and he meant it genuinely, gesturing toward the kitchen garden with an honest nod. "That is a well-kept corn patch." The wariness did not entirely leave her, but some specific edge of it softened. "It is early yet," she said. "Ask me again in August." "I will," he said, and touched the brim of his hat and turned Marshall around and rode back up the track to the road. He spent the next 3 weeks working the Braddock homestead with the focused energy of a man who has too much to do to think about anything else. He repaired the fence line, rechinked the cabin walls against the summer heat and winter to come, cleared a new field of cedar scrub, and spent the better part of a week repairing the roof where 2 sections of planking had rotted and let in the rain. He hired a young man from town named Pete Galloway, 17 and strong and willing to work for fair wages, to help with the heavier work. Pete was a cheerful, uncomplicated presence who told Stephen everything about Redemption Creek that Gus Whatley had not, which was to say the actual texture of the place, who was kind and who was not, where the water ran best and where it ran thin, which stretch of the river flooded in spring and which held steady. Pete also told him, without being asked, more about Ella Hawkins, because Pete was 17 and had not yet learned to curate his information. He told Stephen that she was the best gardener in the county, that she had taught herself to preserve vegetables in glass jars the year before, and had sold them through the winter, that she had once helped deliver a neighbor's calf single-handed when the neighbor was too sick to manage it, and that she came to church every Sunday and sat in the 3rd pew and sang clearly and did not pretend to be more broken up about it than she felt, which Pete seemed to consider a mark in her favor. He also told Stephen, with the casual cruelty of someone who did not know it was cruelty, that Thomas Hawkins had been a hard man in private though a pleasant one in public, and that people who had known Ella before her marriage sometimes wondered what had happened to the girl who used to laugh a great deal. Stephen listened to all of it and said nothing, and filed it away with the same careful precision with which he filed everything, and went back to work. He began to see her in town on Sundays, when both of them came in for the church service and for supplies. She was always neat and self-contained, and she spoke to people politely but did not invite prolonged conversation. The women of the town were kind to her in the particular way that carries a note of pity in it, and the men were either awkward around her or ignored her, and Stephen watched the way she navigated all of it with that lifted chin and those careful eyes, and thought that she was remarkable in ways that the town had organized itself not to notice. He began greeting her after church. Nothing elaborate, just a tip of the hat and a brief word about the weather or the crops or some small observation about the shared landscape of their adjacent properties. She always answered him, and gradually the answers grew from single sentences to brief exchanges, and once, over the 2nd Sunday in May, he made her laugh. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, at something he said about Marshall's opinion of the church bell, which Marshall did not appreciate and expressed through a series of offended sideways steps each time it rang. The laugh lasted only a moment and she drew it back quickly, like a person pulling a hand back from a flame, but it had been real, and he carried it with him out to the Braddock homestead like something found on the road that he did not yet know the use of. The town, of course, noticed. The town always noticed. Mabel Creed mentioned, over supper one evening, that it was a good thing he was being neighborly to the widow Hawkins. She was a decent woman who had had a hard time, though of course he would want to remember that she could not give him a family. Earl Duggan told him, man to man, that Ella Hawkins was fine-looking and pleasant enough in her way, but that a man who was looking to build something needed to think practically, and practically speaking she was not the right foundation. Gus Whatley, when Stephen came in for supplies, said nothing directly but made a remark about how some seeds just did not take no matter how good the soil, and let the remark sit there in the air like a stone in a river. Stephen noticed all of it, and he noticed too how these opinions were spoken in the absolute certainty of men who had decided something, and had no intention of letting new information disturb their conclusion. The verdict on Ella Hawkins had been delivered by Thomas Hawkins to Clarence Peel, and Clarence Peel had distributed it to the town, and the town had accepted it as gospel because it had come from a doctor, and because the alternative, which was to consider whether Thomas Hawkins might have been wrong or dishonest or cruel, was too complicated to bother with. It was in early June that things began to change. He had ridden to town for flour and found that Gus Whatley was out and would not have more until the supply wagon came through on Thursday. He was riding back along the river road, mildly inconvenienced, when he saw Ella's mule standing in the middle of the road with its lead rope trailing and Ella herself nowhere in sight. He pulled up Marshall and scanned the landscape quickly and found her at the bank of the creek, which had risen with recent rains and was running fast and brown. She was standing knee-deep in the current, soaked to the waist, trying to retrieve something from the water with a long stick. It appeared to be a fence post, a cedar post that had apparently been swept from her fence line in the higher water. He tied Marshall to a tree branch and waded in without thinking much about it. The current was cold and stronger than it looked, pulling at his legs. He got past her to the downstream side of the floating post and grabbed it with both hands and dragged it toward the bank, and she grabbed the other end, and they hauled it out together and dropped it on the muddy bank and stood there for a moment, both of them breathing harder than the work entirely warranted, both of them soaked. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out straightforward and without the edge of wariness, which was the first time he had heard her speak that way. "How many did you lose?" he asked, nodding toward her fence line. "3 posts that I could find, and the wire along the south side is all in the creek," she said. She was pushing her wet hair back from her face with both hands, matter-of-fact about her soaked condition. "I have spare wire at the homestead," he said, "and posts I cut last month. Let me bring them over tomorrow and help you put it right." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Easton, I am not a charity." "I know that," he said. "I need someone who knows this land better than I do to tell me whether my east field is worth planting in sorghum or whether I should put it into corn. Come and look at it for me, and we are square." She held the look a moment longer, evaluating him with those careful eyes, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. "All right," she said. They spent the next day side by side, working her fence line in the mild June heat, and it was the longest stretch of time they had spent in each other's company, and something happened in the course of it that Stephen could not have entirely predicted. He had known she was interesting. He had not known she was funny. She had a dry, precise wit that she deployed rarely but with perfect accuracy, and it caught him off guard the first time and made him laugh out loud, and she looked pleased with herself in a way that was entirely unguarded and entirely lovely. She knew the land in a way that he was still learning, knew which plants along the creek were edible and which were not, knew the signs of weather in the clouds and the birds, knew her neighbor's land as well as her own from years of close observation. She told him, while they were stretching wire, that she had grown up in Hill County, north of there, that her father had been a farmer and her mother had run a small school out of their front room, and that she had come to Redemption Creek at 23 when she married Thomas Hawkins, who had seemed at the time like the best opportunity available to a farmer's daughter in a small county. She said this last part without bitterness, but also without illusion, in the same tone she used for other factual matters, and Stephen appreciated the honesty of it. He told her about San Antonio, about his father's cattle operation, and how it had been undermined by 2 bad drought years and poor market timing, and finally the accumulated weight of debt. He told her about the long ride from San Antonio to here, and what he had felt when he had stood in the doorway of the Braddock homestead and looked east over his new land. She listened to that in a particular way, very still, as though the feeling he described was one she knew. "You felt like it was possible again," she said. "Yes," he said, "exactly like that." She nodded slowly and looked out at the creek, and he had the sense that she was thinking about her own version of that feeling, about what it had taken to hold on to it through 2 winters alone. By the end of that day, when the fence was repaired and the last wire stretched and stapled, he knew that he was in serious trouble in the best possible way. He rode home through the long evening light with his heart doing something unfamiliar, and his mind working at twice its usual speed, which was a new experience for a man who had always prided himself on his composure. She came to look at his east field the following week as agreed, and her verdict was corn, definitely corn. The soil was too shallow for sorghum on that side. She walked the field with the authority of someone who knows what they are looking at, crouching here and there to look at the soil, checking the drainage, and when she stood up at the far end she said, almost to herself, "It is good land. You chose well." "I am beginning to think so," he said, and she glanced at him sharply and then away, and there was a color in her cheeks that had not been there before. He began finding reasons to ride by her place. She began finding reasons not to go inside immediately when he did. They talked across the porch rail, talked across fence lines, talked in the long golden evenings when the work was done and the light held on. She was teaching him things about the land without meaning to, and he was learning, and she saw him learn, and something in her responded to it, to the fact that he paid attention, that he remembered what she said, that he treated her knowledge as knowledge rather than as a woman's fussing. On the last Sunday of June, he asked her if he could walk with her to church, and she said yes, and that was a thing that the town of Redemption Creek noticed immediately and thoroughly. Mabel Creed mentioned it over supper that evening with a careful neutrality that barely concealed something between concern and excitement. Earl Duggan told Stephen the following morning that he was a decent fellow and he would hate to see him make a mistake he couldn't unmake. Gus Whatley's wife, a sharp-featured woman named Hortense, stopped Ella in the street that week and asked, in the tone of a woman performing a kindness, whether she had been clear with Mr. Easton about her circumstances, because it would be a shame for him to get the wrong impression. Ella told Stephen about that conversation, not complaining, just reporting it, when they sat on her porch on a July evening and watched the bats come out over the creek at dusk. She told it matter-of-factly, the way she told most things, but he saw her jaw tighten at the memory of it. "What did you say to her?" he asked. "I told her that my circumstances were my own business," Ella said, "and that Mr. Easton was capable of managing his own impressions." "I am," he said. She looked at him. The evening was warm and the air smelled of the creek and the wild plum bushes along the bank, and the bats were making their small frantic patterns above the water, and he looked back at her and the moment held itself still. "The whole town thinks I am broken," she said, not as an accusation, just as a fact being laid on the table. "The whole town," he said carefully, "is working from a dead man's word about something that is not simple." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He believed it, Thomas. He believed it was my failing." "That may be," Stephen said, "but believing something does not make it true, and even if it were true, it would not make you broken." She looked at him for a long time after that, in the particular way of someone who has heard something they did not expect and are not quite sure yet what to do with it. The bats wheeled and dove over the dark water. A nightjar called somewhere in the cedars, and something between them that had been building all through the spring and summer arrived at a new place in that moment, not complete yet, but closer. He wanted to tell her that he had thought about her every single day since he had ridden up to this porch in April. He wanted to tell her that her laugh had lived in his chest for 2 months like something warm. He wanted to tell her that he had lain awake on multiple nights working through what he felt with the methodical precision he applied to everything, and had concluded with absolute certainty that it was real, and that it mattered more than any practical concern the town of Redemption Creek could produce. He did not say all of that. Instead he said, "Ella, I would very much like to court you if you would allow it." She was quiet for what felt like a very long time, and he let the silence be what it was, because he had learned that she needed space to come to her own conclusions without being hurried. People will talk, she said at last. They are already talking, he said. I have not found it particularly damaging. That almost smile came back, the one that lived near the corner of her mouth. No, she said, I don't suppose you have. She turned to look at the creek again and then back to him. All right, Mr. Easton, you may court me. He let out a breath he had not been holding consciously. Stephen, he said. My name is Stephen. Stephen, she said, and the way she said it was like something being settled into its right place. July and August were the months in which Stephen Easton fell comprehensively and irreversibly in love with Ella Hawkins, and he did it in the plain daylight of daily proximity and honest conversation, which he thought was the best way to fall in love, the way that was most likely to hold. He knew the specific moment, he was certain of it, though he had suspected it for weeks. It was an August morning, hot and brilliant, and he had come by to help her repair the roof of her chicken coop, which had a section that had been threatening to collapse since spring. They were up on the roof together, working in the direct sun, and she was handing him nails from a tin can and pointing out exactly where the new boards needed to go, and at some point she started to hum. It was a hymn he recognized, one they sang in church, and she was not performing it. She was not aware of it, she was just humming while she worked, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at her, and she looked up and caught him looking and said, What? Nothing, he said. I just like hearing you hum. She looked startled, and then she ducked her head over the nail tin with that color in her cheeks again, and he went back to nailing, and he knew with the same certainty with which he knew soil quality and water tables, and the right time to plant, that this was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. He began to think about asking her to marry him the way he thought about any project that mattered, which was carefully and thoroughly. He knew the practical objections. They had known each other only 4 months. The town's opinion was largely skeptical. She had been told something about herself that he did not believe, but that she might believe about herself, and that would need to be addressed honestly. He had a homestead that was still in the early stages of becoming what it needed to be. These were real considerations. He took them seriously. But he had also learned, in the year since the San Antonio operation had failed, that waiting for perfect conditions was a way of waiting forever, and that some things were worth beginning before you were entirely ready for them, because the readiness came from the doing and not from the preparation. He decided in the first week of September that he would ask her. He did not do it the way he had initially planned, which had involved a proper Sunday evening and a formal request. What actually happened was simpler than that, and more honest, and more like both of them. He had come over on a Tuesday afternoon with a bag of apples from a wild tree he had found along his fence line, and they had sat on her porch peeling apples for preserving, working side by side in the September heat with 2 knives and a large enameled bowl, and they were talking about the coming winter and the stores she had laid by and what more she needed. And in the middle of a conversation about cornmeal he stopped, put his apple and his knife down in his lap and said, Ella, I want to marry you. She went still, not frightened still but thinking still, which he had learned to distinguish. You know what the town says about me, she said. The town says you cannot have children, he said. Thomas Hawkins told Clarence Peale that, and Clarence Peale told everyone else, and everyone else accepted it as absolute truth. I do not know whether it is true, but I know that it is not the thing that decides this for me. You are what decides it. She set her own apple down. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the creek road, and her jaw was doing that particular tightening thing that he now recognized as her working through something that mattered. What if it is true, she said very quietly. What if they are right? Then we build our life another way, he said simply. There is more than one way to make a life, Ella. She turned and looked at him then, full and direct, with those careful eyes that had been evaluating him since April, and he let her look because he had nothing to hide in what she was looking for. He meant it. He meant every word of it. You would think differently, she said. In time. You would want children and I could not give them to you, and you would come to feel— Stop, he said, gently but firmly. You are telling me what Thomas Hawkins felt. I am telling you what I feel. Those are different men and different feelings. The words landed between them and she breathed in slowly and let the breath out, and he watched the tension go out of her shoulders in a way that it rarely did, and her eyes were bright with something she was clearly not going to allow to become tears in front of him, not yet. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you will marry me," he asked, because he wanted to be clear. "Yes, Stephen, I will marry you." And now there was a tremble in her voice that she controlled immediately, and she picked up her apple and her knife and went back to peeling, except that her hands were not quite steady. He picked up his apple too, and they sat there in the September afternoon peeling apples, and he was smiling and she was not looking at him, but the corner of her mouth was doing that thing, that almost smile that had lived in his memory since April, and it was not almost any more. It was complete. He rode to town that evening and told no one, because it was not the town's business yet. He had one thing to do first. He went to see Reverend James Albright, who ran Redemption Creek's small white church with more goodwill than authority, and who received Stephen in his front room with a cup of coffee and a patient expression. Stephen told him he wanted to marry Ella Hawkins, and he wanted to do it at sunrise privately, before the town had the chance to involve itself. He said this without embarrassment, because he felt none. He explained that he respected Ella, and that he wanted the morning of their marriage to belong to them alone before it belonged to the town's opinion. Reverend Albright had been a minister for 30 years and had performed marriages in rain and shine and once during a hailstorm, and he had long since stopped being surprised by the decisions of people in love. He looked at Stephen over his coffee and said, "You know what people say about her." "I know what people say," Stephen said. "I am not interested in what people say." Albright nodded slowly. "She is a good woman," he said. "A strong woman. She has endured more than this town has given her credit for." He set down his coffee. "I will be there at sunrise, any particular morning." "Saturday," Stephen said. "This Saturday." "I will be there," Albright said. He went back to Ella and told her what he had arranged, and she looked at him with something startled and wondering in her eyes and said, "At sunrise, this Saturday." "Unless you need more time," he said. She thought about it for a count of 3 seconds. "No," she said. "Saturday at sunrise is right." They had the rest of the week, which was enough time for Ella to press and air her best dress, a deep green wool with ivory buttons that she had not worn since before Thomas Hawkins had died, and enough time for Stephen to ride to Marble Falls and collect the ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a single garnet that he had carried in his saddlebag from San Antonio like a talisman. He had not known when he packed it who he might give it to or whether he would, but he had packed it because it felt like hope. On the Friday evening before the wedding, they sat on her porch again as they had done all summer, and the conversation was different from usual. Lighter and heavier at the same time. She told him things she had not told him before, about the early years of her marriage, the way Thomas Hawkins had been warm in public and cold in private, the way his disappointment about children had curdled into something that he wore like a judgment. She said this not to make him angry on her behalf, though he felt it, but because she wanted him to understand what she was bringing with her into this new thing, what the bruises were and where they were, so that he could see them and know them and not stumble into them by accident. He told her about Clara Reeves and about the failure in San Antonio, not the practical facts of it, which she knew, but the private humiliation of watching something his father had built come apart in his hands. He told her that he had felt for a while as though he were carrying a sentence about himself, that he was the kind of man who could not hold things together, and that coming to Redemption Creek had been partly about proving that sentence wrong. She listened to all of it in that still, intent way she had, and then she said, "We are going to be good for each other." "I know it," he said. "I am not entirely easy to know," she said. "I have been alone a long time, and I have built walls I am not always sure where to find." "I am patient," he said. "You are," she agreed. "It is one of the things I noticed first." They watched the stars come out over the creek, one by one, the way they did in those clear September skies in the Texas hill country, thick and unhurried. The nightjars called. The creek murmured its own conversation with the stones. And they sat together in the quiet of it, which was a comfortable quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled. He left at 10 o'clock and rode home under those stars with his heart so full he could hardly hold it all. The morning of the 15th of September, 1878, came in cold and clear. Stephen was awake before any light, which was not unusual for him, but this morning he dressed with unusual care, putting on his good blue shirt and his cleanest trousers, and polishing his boots to the best shine they could manage. He saddled Marshall in the dark of the barn and rode east along the river road with the sky beginning to lighten at the far edge of the world, a thin line of silver and rose that widened as he rode. Reverend Albright was already there when he arrived, having walked from town with a lantern that he no longer needed, blowing it out as the sky continued to brighten. He was a compact, gray-haired man in a dark coat, and he greeted Stephen with a handshake and no fuss. Ella opened her door before they could knock. She had been up since before them, that was clear. She was wearing the green dress, which fit her in the morning light in a way that made Stephen have to remind himself to breathe. Her hair was pinned more carefully than usual, with a small white flower from her kitchen garden tucked just above her ear, a late-season wild aster, pale and precise. She looked at him standing in her doorway in the growing morning light, and he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You wore the green dress," he said finally. "I have been saving it," she said, "for something worth wearing it to." They stood at the edge of her porch, facing east, as the sun climbed the horizon and broke into full color, orange and gold, and a pink so deep it was almost red, spreading across the sky and setting the dew on the creek grass glittering. Reverend Albright read the words of the service clearly and simply, without flourish, which was right for both of them. When he came to the part about the vows, Stephen took both of Ella's hands in his, and he looked at her the way he had been wanting to look at her for months without the pretense of looking at something else. "I, Stephen Easton, take you, Ella Hawkins, to be my wife," he said, and the words felt like the most true thing he had ever said in his life. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better and for worse, for richer and for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. Her hands tightened on his, and she said her own vows in her clear, steady voice, and when she got to the words to love and to cherish, her voice dipped for just a moment, not breaking but deepening, as though the words were more weight than she had anticipated, and she was accepting that weight deliberately. He put his mother's garnet ring on her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. Reverend Albright pronounced them husband and wife as the sun cleared the horizon entirely, and threw its full September light across the creek and the fields, and the two of them standing together on that porch. And Stephen took his wife's face in his hands, and kissed her with the tender certainty of a man who knows he has found the right thing, and is not going to waste a moment of it. She kissed him back, and her hands found the lapels of his jacket, and when they pulled apart her eyes were bright, and the white flower was still in her hair, and the sun was all the way up. "Good morning, Mrs. Easton," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Easton," she said, and the smile that broke across her face in that moment was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen from her, full and real and belonging entirely to this new morning. Reverend Albright signed the marriage record, shook both their hands with warm congratulations, and walked back to town, where he arrived before the Sunday service preparations began. He was a man who respected privacy, and he said nothing immediately, but privacy in a town the size of Redemption Creek was a limited commodity. By 10 o'clock that same morning, Gus Whatley's wife Hortense had seen Reverend Albright and noted his formal coat and deduced something. By 10:30 she had asked him directly, and he had confirmed it. By 11 o'clock the news had reached Gus, who told Earl Duggan, who told Mabel Creed, who told the two men at her boarding-house table. By noon, the entire town of Redemption Creek knew that Stephen Easton had married Ella Hawkins at sunrise that morning. The reaction was precisely what Stephen had expected, which was a mixture of genuine surprise, genuine goodwill from some quarters, and from others the particular discomfort of people who have committed to a story and are now being told the story has changed. Gus Whatley sought Stephen out that afternoon, finding him at the general store where Stephen had come for supplies, and Gus had the expression of a man who needs to convey something important for Stephen's own good. "I hope you went into this with your eyes open," Gus said, lowering his voice to the confiding register he used for serious business. "I went into it in the full daylight of a September morning," Stephen said pleasantly. "My eyes could not have been more open." Gus pressed on. "What I mean is, the situation with Mrs. Hawkins, or I suppose Mrs. Easton now, the situation." "You mean the fact that you and every man in this town have spent 2 years treating her as though she is less than she is," Stephen said, still pleasantly, wrapping his hand around his parcel. "I went into it knowing that. It struck me as more a comment on the town than on Ella." Gus went red. He was not a bad man, Stephen recognized that. He was simply a man who had never been required to question whether the things he believed were true. "We were only thinking of what was practical," Gus said, with less certainty than he'd started. "I understand that," Stephen said. "I hope in time you will understand that she is remarkable, and that any man would be fortunate to have her, and that none of what you were told about her should have been told to you in the first place, and none of you should have passed it around the way you did." He picked up his parcel. "She is my wife now, and I am proud of it. I hope you will come to congratulate us properly when you are ready." He walked out of the store into the September noon, called fools by implication if not by name, and felt entirely at peace with every word he had said. Earl Duggan he handled similarly. Mabel Creed, to her credit, came to him that evening with a plate of apple cake and a genuine apology, saying she should have been a better neighbor to Ella Hawkins, and that she intended to remedy that going forward. He thanked her for the cake and told her that Ella would appreciate the gesture, and meant it. What he did not anticipate, and what moved him more than anything that had happened since the sunrise wedding, was what happened the following Sunday at church. He and Ella came in together, which was itself notable, and sat side by side in the third pew, which had always been hers. And something in the town, which had had a week to adjust its thinking or at least its behavior, shifted. Women who had always kept Ella at a slight arm's length came and shook her hand properly. Men who had ignored her came and shook Stephen's hand and said congratulations, and then turned to Ella and said it to her too, and some of them managed to mean it. It was not a full conversion. Gus Whatley was still working things out in his head, that was visible. But the verdict that had been so confidently passed, that settled, final certainty about who Ella Hawkins was and what she was worth, had cracked. And in the crack, something like the actual Ella Hawkins, the one Stephen had been seeing all summer, had room to exist. After the service, Reverend Albright gave a sermon about the difference between what we are told and what we know, which may or may not have been inspired by recent events, and Stephen sat in the third pew with his wife's hand in his, and thought that Redemption Creek was an interesting place and might yet become something worth belonging to. They moved Ella's things to the Braddock homestead in the days that followed, which Stephen now thought of simply as the homestead, or theirs, and the process of combining two lives into one house was the kind of work that either suits two people or reveals all the ways it does not, and in their case it suited them almost completely. She had opinions about where things should go, and so did he, and they negotiated them without difficulty, which seemed to him a good sign. She brought her glass jars of preserved vegetables and arranged them on the pantry shelves with an expertise he admired. She brought her few good pieces of furniture, a rocking chair and a small table and the blue and white quilt her mother had made her, and the house that had been a project became something that felt, with these additions, like a home. He added a room to the house that winter, working on it in the short cold days when the field work was done, building it out from the south side of the structure with Pete Galloway's help, a proper sitting room with two south-facing windows to catch the winter sun. Ella came out every day to see the progress and brought coffee, and sometimes stood inside the framed walls and said, "This wall will be good for a bookshelf," or "There should be a hook beside the door for your hat." He built what she suggested, and it was better for it. The winter was not easy, but it was good. They learned each other in the close quarters of those cold months, learned each other's rhythms and moods and the particular ways that each of them needed to be alone sometimes and together at other times. He learned that she went quiet when she was worried, not cold but inward, and that the right response was to stay near without pressing. She learned that he woke sometimes in the deep night with the old anxiety about the farm, the inherited fear of failure, and that what helped was the plain reality of her beside him, warm and solid, which was something he could not have predicted the value of but which was immense. They had their first real argument in January, about money, which is the most common thing for new marriages to argue about, and it was not a terrible argument but it was a real one, with raised voices and a door closed more firmly than necessary, and a subsequent 2 hours of cold silence that was profoundly uncomfortable for both of them. And then she came and sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I'm not good at needing help. I need you to know that about me." "I know it," he said. "I was alone for 2 years and I learned to manage alone," she said, "and it is an adjustment. It is an adjustment for me too," he said. "I have never had someone else's welfare to consider in my decisions before. I'm still learning how to do it." She looked at him steadily. "We are both still learning," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then let's be patient with each other," she said, and he reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and that was the end of the argument, which he thought was about as good a resolution as two honest people could manage. In February, she told him something that she said matter-of-factly, but which cost her more than her tone revealed. She said that in the last month of Thomas Hawkins's life, when he was sick and feverish and she was nursing him, he had told her again that the absence of children was her failure, that she was built wrong, that she had been a disappointment to him. She said this not for sympathy but because she realized she was still carrying it in a way that affected how she spoke about herself and her future, and she wanted him to know where it came from. He was quiet for a long time after she told him. He was angry, a clean, quiet anger at a dead man who had taken his own failure of character and pressed it onto a woman who had deserved better. But anger at the dead was its own kind of useless, so he set it aside. "He was wrong," Stephen said. "I want you to know that I believe that completely. I do not know what the truth is about children, and I do not know that anyone can know for certain, but I know that a sick man looking for someone to blame is not a source of medical truth, and I know that whatever the truth is, it is not your fault." She had listened to that with her eyes slightly bright. "I want to believe it," she said. "Then start there," he said. "Believe that you want to believe it and see where that takes you." The spring of 1879 came in with a wet March and a warm April that broke the winter's grip all at once and sent everything growing at once. The creek grass and the bluebonnets and the corn Stephen had planted in his east field, and the kitchen garden Ella expanded by a third. They worked side by side in those spring mornings, which was one of his favorite things in the new shape of his life, working alongside her in the early light before the heat built, talking and not talking with equal comfort, doing the work of building something real. Pete Galloway came by regularly and had developed a somewhat worshipful attitude toward Ella, which amused Stephen considerably, and which Ella accepted with the directness she brought to everything, assigning Pete tasks with the ease of someone used to figuring out what needed doing. Pete's mother, a widow woman named Agnes Galloway who lived in town, came to call one afternoon in April and stayed for 2 hours and ate 3 of Ella's cornbread squares and declared her the finest woman in Redemption Creek. And this opinion, coming from Agnes Galloway, who was known and liked, did more for Ella's standing in the town than anything else could have. It was in May, 13 months after Stephen had first ridden up to Ella's porch on that April morning, that Ella came to find him in the east field, where he was working the first cultivation of the corn. She walked out to him across the newly turned earth with a look on her face that he had never seen before, a look that was more complicated and more luminous than anything in her usual careful range of expression. "Stephen," she said, stopping in front of him. He straightened, looking at her. "What is it?" She was quiet for a moment, as though the words needed to be arranged in a particular way to come out right. "I am not certain yet," she said. "It is early. It may come to nothing." She stopped. He watched her. Something in the luminous complication of her expression was beginning to make his heart beat faster. "I believe I may be with child," she said. The field went very still around him, or he went very still in it, one of the two. He looked at his wife standing in his cornfield in the May sunlight with a look on her face that held the entire complicated history of what she had been told about herself and what she was now encountering as different from that truth, and his heart did something that he had no word for, no word precise enough. "Ella," he said. "I know what was said," she said quickly, before he could continue. "I know what Thomas said. I know what the whole town believes, and I may be wrong. It is very early and he crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, gently, the way he had done at the sunrise wedding, and she stopped talking. "Tell me what you feel," he said. "Not what anyone said. What do you feel?" She looked up at him with those careful eyes, and in them he saw something cracking open that had been sealed for a very long time. "I feel as though it might be true," she said. "I feel different. I have felt different for 2 weeks, and I did not dare to say so. Then we will wait," he said, "and we will see, and whatever comes of it, we will face it together." She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he held her there in the middle of the cornfield in the May morning, and she did not cry exactly, but she breathed in a particular way that was the Ella equivalent of it. It was true. By June there was no question. Dr. Peel, who had the grace to look rather uncomfortable examining a woman about whom he had distributed a particular piece of information to an entire town, confirmed what they both already knew. He said it with professional briskness and told her what to do and not do, and did not address the elephant of contradiction that stood in his examination room, which was that the woman he had told the whole of Redemption Creek was barren was sitting in front of him in her 5th month of pregnancy. Ella addressed it for him. She said, when he had finished, "I believe you may want to revise some of what you told people about me, Dr. Peel." He had gone very red. "I only passed on what Thomas. I know what you passed on," she said, "and I know why. And I am telling you now that you were wrong, and I would appreciate it if the town heard that from you as clearly as they heard the other." It was one of the best things Stephen had ever witnessed. He stood behind Ella's chair and watched the doctor absorb the direct, precise, unflinching correction of Ella Hawkins' Easton, and he thought he had never admired anyone more in his life. Clarence Peel did, to his credit, make it right. He was not a bad man, only a careless one, and careless men sometimes find their carelessness returned to them in a form they cannot ignore. He mentioned it at the next town council meeting, which Gus Whatley ran, and to which the significant women of the town were not invited, but from which information flowed outward immediately. He said that he had been working from second-hand information about Mrs. Easton, formerly Mrs. Hawkins, and that the information had been incorrect, and that he regretted having treated it as reliable. The town absorbed this news with varying degrees of grace. Some people, the ones who had been uncomfortable with the original verdict anyway, received it with relief. Some people, the ones who had invested in the certainty of it, received it with the particular annoyance of those who dislike being wrong. Gus Whatley said nothing at the meeting but went home and had a long conversation with Hortense, after which Hortense came to call on Ella the following Tuesday with a jar of preserved peaches and an apology that was genuine even if it was not easy. Ella received it with her characteristic directness and said she appreciated it and offered Hortense a cup of coffee, and Hortense sat in the new sitting room with the south-facing windows and drank it, and they talked for an hour, and it was not comfortable yet, but it was a beginning. Earl Duggan bought Stephen a drink at the Dusty Boot Saloon one evening and said, without quite managing to meet Stephen's eyes, that he supposed he had spoken out of turn about Ella, and he was sorry for it. Stephen said he was glad to hear it, and that the best thing Earl could do was extend the same respect to her that he extended to anyone, and Earl said he would do that, and Stephen believed him. The summer of 1879 was the best of Stephen's life to that point, and he was aware of it while it was happening, which seemed important, to know your best time while you are in it rather than only in the looking back. The homestead was productive. The corn came in well. The cattle he had purchased in the spring were thriving on the creek pasture. Ella's kitchen garden was a wonder that the whole of the county's women came to examine and admire, and she had expanded her preserving operation to the point where she was selling through Gus Whatley's store, a business arrangement she had negotiated herself with a precision that left Gus slightly dazzled. And Ella herself was changing in ways that he watched with a quiet, steady joy. Some of the wariness she had built into every interaction was loosening. She laughed more readily. She made friends, real ones, not the careful managed acquaintances she had maintained before, but actual friends. Agnes Galloway, who came by twice a week, and a young woman named Rosa Medina, who had come to Redemption Creek with her husband, a vaquero who had taken work at a nearby ranch, and who found in Ella a neighbor without condescension. Ella was outspoken about the fact that Rosa deserved the same treatment as any woman in town, and said so plainly when it was needed, which was sometimes. It was in her character, that directness, and it was becoming more rather than less as the fear that had held it in check began to lift. He woke one August morning before the sun and lay still in the darkness with his hand flat against the warm curve of her belly, feeling the life that moved in it, and thought about his father and the farm that had been lost, and about the road from San Antonio and all the things he had been carrying when he rode into Redemption Creek on that April morning of the year before, and about the morning of the sunrise wedding and the look on Ella's face, and about every morning since. And he thought that a man could not reasonably ask for more than this, and he did not ask for more. He just held what he had and was grateful. He told her so later that morning over coffee on the porch, which was where they had taken to spending the first half hour of every day, watching the light come up over the creek and the fields. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am happy, not in the uncertain way, not conditionally, actually happy." She looked at him sideways the way she did when she was evaluating something. "You are telling me this specifically?" "Yes," he said, "because I know that you have wondered. I know that you have listened for the shift, the place where what I said on that Tuesday in September turns out to have been less than true. I want you to know it has not come. I am more certain now than I was then." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran in the early morning and a meadowlark called from the fence post, and the summer was gold at the edges of things. "I have wondered," she said honestly. "Old habits." "I know," he said. "I'm just making sure you have current information." That corner of the mouth smile appeared full and warm, and she reached over and took his hand. "I'm happy too," she said. "More than I know how to say, more than I thought was coming to me." "It was always coming to you," he said. "It just took its time getting here." She squeezed his hand, and they drank their coffee in the meadowlark morning, and the summer went on around them golden and good. Their son was born in the first week of October 1879. On a cool blue afternoon that smelled of cedar and creek water and the turned earth of the fields after the harvest. Agnes Galloway and Rosa Medina were both present, having arrived when the labor began that morning, and between the three of them they managed the thing with a competence that left Stephen, who had been relegated firmly to the porch, more impressed than he had ever been by anything he had not been permitted to participate in. Agnes came to the door at 3 in the afternoon and said, with a face that contained the specific satisfaction of a woman who has helped bring a new person into the world, "You have a son, Mr. Easton. And your wife is well. You can come in." He went in, and Ella was propped against the pillows they had arranged against the headboard, with her hair damp and her face exhausted and proud, and in her arms was a very small, very red, very emphatic person who was announcing his arrival to the world with complete vocal confidence. Stephen sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and he could not find a single word adequate to what he felt, which was the largest thing he had ever felt, larger even than the morning of the sunrise wedding, because this was built on the foundation of everything since that morning, all those months of knowing her and being known by her. "He looks like you," Ella said in the exhausted, wondering voice of a woman who has just accomplished something enormous. "He looks like himself," Stephen said, which was true. The baby had opinions already, that was clear. "What shall we name him?" Ella asked. They had discussed names and had settled on a short list, and Stephen looked at his son's red-faced certainty and said, "I think he is a Daniel. He came into the world like he is not afraid of anything." Ella looked at the baby and then back at Stephen and said, "Daniel James Easton." James had been Stephen's father's name. "Yes," Stephen said. She shifted the baby carefully, and Stephen put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, both of them looking at their son, who was beginning to wind down from his arrival announcement and was discovering that there were other, more interesting things to attend to. The news reached town that evening. Agnes Galloway took it, because Agnes Galloway was a woman who understood that news needed to travel and who delivered it with the full weight of its significance. She told Mabel Creed and Reverend Albright and 3 other women she passed on the main street, and by supper the whole of Redemption Creek knew that Stephen and Ella Easton had a son. The response was a thing Stephen had not entirely anticipated, which was that it was almost entirely warm. People came in the following days to leave food on the porch, as was the custom, and to express their congratulations, and there was something in the collective tone of the town's response that spoke of a real shift rather than a polite one. The story of Ella Hawkins, the story that had defined her to Redemption Creek for 2 years, had been replaced by a different one. The replacement had been happening gradually since September of the year before, since the sunrise wedding and the noon revelation and Stephen's quiet, consistent, cheerful refusal to accept the town's version of his wife. But Daniel James Easton's arrival was the exclamation point at the end of it. Gus Whatley came himself, which Stephen had not expected. He came with Hortense and they stood on the porch, and Gus held his hat in his hands and said, with more humility than Stephen had seen from him before, that he was glad for them both, and that the boy was a fine thing for the community, and that he had perhaps spoken too quickly about things that were not his business. It was not a full accounting, but it was genuine, and Stephen shook his hand, and Ella, who was sitting in the rocking chair on the porch with Daniel in her arms, nodded to Gus with the precise, unsparing dignity of a woman who accepts an apology without dismissing what made it necessary. Hortense bent over the baby and said he was beautiful, which was generous given that Daniel still had the compressed, emphatic look of a very new person, but which Ella received with a real smile because it was meant. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was their second winter in the house, and they were settled into it fully by now, into the rhythms of each other and the place. Daniel was a robust and vocal presence who slept in the crib Stephen had built from cedar in the corner of the main room, close enough to the fire to be warm, and who had opinions about many things and communicated them without reservation. Ella nursed him and managed him with the same competence and practical love with which she managed everything, and Stephen watched her become a mother with the same quiet awe with which he had watched her become his wife, as though each new version of her contained and built on all the previous versions, adding without taking away. He hired a second hand in the spring of 1880, a man named Hector Ruiz, who had been recommended by Rosa Medina's husband, and who turned out to be one of the finest cattlemen Stephen had ever encountered, with a specific gift for reading the land and the animals that was the product of decades of knowledge. Hector was quiet and competent, and Stephen paid him fairly, which in 1880 in Texas was not always the case for Mexican workers, and which Hector acknowledged not with excess gratitude but with a solid reliability that was worth more. With Hector's help, the cattle operation expanded, and by the summer of 1880, the Easton homestead was producing enough to be genuinely prosperous rather than merely surviving, which was a threshold that had real meaning to a man who had spent the previous years closer to the other side of it. Stephen paid off the last of his father's debts, which he had carried as an obligation even though he had no legal requirement to do so, sending the final payment to the bank in San Antonio with a brief letter and a feeling of clean closure that was one of the better feelings he had known. He told Ella about it over dinner, and she understood immediately what it meant, not just the money but the other thing, the lifting of the inherited weight. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like land that has been cleared," he said, "ready for something to be planted in it." She smiled at him across the table with Daniel on her knee making determined efforts to reach the bread basket. "Then plant something good," she said. "I intend to," he said, and meant it in more ways than she perhaps knew in that moment. The years that followed were years of building, in the truest sense, the kind of building that is not dramatic but that compounds over time into something remarkable. Stephen added 2 more rooms to the house by 1882, which by that point was necessary because Ella was carrying their second child, and Daniel, who was 2.5 and had never been short on confidence, needed a room of his own before he decided he ran the whole establishment. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1882, and they named her Clara, not after Clara Reeves of San Antonio, who had thought more of her own prospects than his, but after Ella's mother, the woman who had run the school from her front room in Hill County and who had died when Ella was 15. It was a reclaiming of a good name for a good purpose. Clara came into the world with her mother's auburn hair and her father's careful eyes, and a temperament somewhere between the two of them, quieter than Daniel, but with a watchfulness that suggested she was taking careful note of everything. Reverend Albright baptized both children in the church with its peeling white paint, which by 1882 had been repainted because the town had organized a work party for it, and which now stood properly white against the blue Texas sky. The congregation had changed in its relationship to the Easton family in the years since the sunrise wedding and the noon revelation, not uniformly, not without some backsliding of old attitudes, but genuinely. The story the town told about itself included the Eastons now, and that meant it also included Ella, the real Ella, the one who had been there all along. She had been teaching reading and writing to 3 of the neighboring children whose families could not afford the new school that the town finally built in 1881, which was the same instinct her mother had had, to see the knowledge that needed sharing and share it. She did it on Tuesday afternoons at the kitchen table, with Daniel usually underfoot and Clara in a basket by the fire, and the 3 children who came learned more from her in those 2 hours a week than many children learned in a full school day, because she taught the way she did everything, directly and without condescension, with a respect for what they could manage if they were given the right tools. Earl Duggan, of all people, had become something close to a friend, or at least a genuine neighbor, which in some ways was more useful. He brought news from town still, because it was his nature, but the nature of the news had changed, because he now spoke of Ella as a person of substance and standing rather than a case to be reported. He helped Stephen with the fence repairs in the spring, and in return Stephen helped him with a water trough project at the livery stable, and that was the economy of neighbors, the one that worked because it was built on something mutual. Pete Galloway grew from 17 to 20, and then 21, and then 22. And somewhere in that time, he stopped working for Stephen as a hired hand and started working the farm his own family had let slide, which was adjacent land to the north, and he asked Stephen's advice about it with a regularity that told Stephen the boy had grown into someone worth talking to. He married a girl from Marble Falls named Susanna, and the 4 of them, Stephen and Ella, Pete and Susanna, formed the kind of neighborly friendship that does not need to be tended constantly, but that is reliably there when it is wanted. By the autumn of 1883, 5 years since the Sunrise wedding, the Easton homestead was among the most prosperous in the county, not dramatically, not in the way that draws attention or envy, but solidly, the way things are when they have been built carefully and maintained honestly. The cattle herd had grown to 100 head. The corn fields were reliably productive. Ella's preserving business had expanded into a small but real enterprise, supplying Gus Whatley's store and 2 businesses in Marble Falls, and she managed it with the same practical precision she brought to everything. Hector Ruiz had brought his wife and 2 children from San Antonio, and they lived in the small house Stephen, and Ella had helped him build on the south edge of the property. And his children played in the creek with Daniel and Clara on summer afternoons, while the adults worked or talked on the porch. And it was a good life, complicated in the way all real lives are but good at its core. On the 5th anniversary of the Sunrise wedding, September 15, 1883, Stephen woke before dawn for the first time since that morning, which he had not done on purpose but which felt right. He lay still in the dark room with Ella warm beside him and Daniel and Clara asleep in their rooms down the new hallway, and he listened to the sounds of the house and the land around it, the creek and the early birds and the cattle moving on the south pasture, and he thought about the man who had ridden into Redemption Creek 5 years before with a saddlebag and a worn Bible and a rumor that had preceded him. He thought about what Corbin Hale had told him at that roadside in outside Careville. Barren and broken, Corbin had said, with that particular shrug. And Stephen had said nothing because he had not yet met her, and because even then, without knowing her, something in him had been skeptical of the certainty with which the verdict had been delivered, that certainty that comes from people who have decided not to look too closely. He thought about all the things the town had been wrong about Ella Hawkins, about what she was and what she was worth and what was possible for her. And he thought about how the town had, slowly and imperfectly and with several steps backward before each step forward, adjusted its view. Not all the way, perhaps not all the way ever, but enough. Enough that his wife walked through Redemption Creek as herself now fully and was treated as what she was. Ella stirred beside him and turned her head and found him awake. "You are thinking loudly," she said, her voice soft with sleep. "I am thinking about 5 years," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she moved closer and put her head on his shoulder in the dark. 5 years, she said. 5 years since I rode up your track and you were standing on the porch with a hoe, he said, prepared to use it if necessary. He felt her smile against his shoulder. "I was not sure about you," she said. "I know," he said. "I was sure enough for both of us as it turned out." "You were," she agreed. "Insufferably certain." "Accurately certain," he said. She laughed, the real laugh, the one he had first heard in April 1878 about Marshall and the church bell, the one that had lived in his chest like something warm and had lived there ever since. "Yes," she said. "Accurately." They lay in the pre-dawn dark, and he held her and she held him, and the house was full of the breathing of their children and the life they had built together. When the first light came through the east window, they got up together and dressed and went out to the porch to drink their coffee in the sunrise, which they had done every morning that weather and work permitted since the morning of their wedding. The September light came up the same way it always did in the Texas hill country, dramatic and golden, painting the creek and the fields in colors that seemed too vivid to be practical, but that were simply the truth of that particular place at that particular hour. "I want to tell you something," Ella said, looking at the sunrise. "Tell me," he said. She turned to look at him. 5 years had put a small addition of sunlines at the corners of her eyes and a steadiness in her expression that was different from the careful wariness of the woman on the porch in 1878. It was the steadiness of someone who has learned what they can trust. She was 32 now, and she was more herself than she had been at 27, and that was the direction they were both moving, he thought, more and more themselves as time went on, the unnecessary things falling away. "I want to tell you that when you came riding up that track in April 5 years ago, I was almost done," she said. I do not mean I was going to do something desperate. I mean I was running out of the thing that lets you keep trying, the belief that it matters, that you matter. He was very still, listening. And then you came and you were so steady, she said. So relentlessly steady. You never treated me like a problem or a pity case or a woman whose story had already been written for her. You just treated me like a person worth knowing. And it sounds simple when I say it, but it was not simple to receive. It was the most difficult thing I had ever been given, because I had to decide to believe I deserved it. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and looked at him with those careful, warm, sure eyes that were so different now from the evaluating eyes on the porch in 1878. You deserved it the day I met you, he said. You deserved it before that. The town was wrong about you. Thomas Hawkins was wrong about you. And I am grateful every single morning that I was the one who got to find that out. She squeezed his hand and looked back at the sunrise, and he watched her face in the golden light. This woman who had decided to believe she deserved good things and had thereby become the best thing in his life. And he thought that there was no version of the story that could have gone better than the one he was living. Daniel appeared at the door behind them, 4 years old and roaring with the energy of a child who has slept a full 10 hours and considers that more than sufficient, announcing that he was hungry and that Clara was still sleeping, but he was not going to be responsible for what happened if breakfast was not forthcoming. Ella turned from the sunrise and caught her son with both arms and lifted him onto her hip, which he accepted with the casual confidence of a child who has never doubted he was wanted. Eggs, she said. And biscuits, Daniel said firmly. Eggs and biscuits, she said, and carried him inside. Stephen sat a moment longer in the sunrise, listening to his wife and his son negotiate breakfast through the open door with the particular affectionate combat of two people who are very similar and know it. And then he got up and went inside to make the coffee. Clara woke an hour later and came to the kitchen table with her father's careful eyes blinking at the morning light, and sat in her chair and allowed the biscuit Stephen placed before her to be examined thoroughly before she ate it, which was entirely her character. After breakfast, Ella told him, with the matter-of-fact directness she had always used for important news, that she believed there was a third child coming. She said she was not entirely certain yet. It was early. She had been wrong before about the early signs. She was not sure. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with Daniel making a construction project out of the remaining biscuit crumbs, and Clara still examining her cup with scientific interest, and he said, "Then we will wait, and we will see, and whatever comes of it, we will face it together." She recognized the words, which were the same ones he had said 5 years before in the cornfield, and her expression did the thing it did when something arrived in her that was too large for her face to contain entirely. "You always say that," she said. "I always mean it," he said. She reached across the table and touched his face, briefly and wholly, the gesture of a woman who has stopped measuring what she allows herself and has found that abundance suits her better than caution. "I know," she said. The third child, a boy they named William after Ella's father, came into the world in the spring of 1884, and he was not as vocal as Daniel about his arrival, but had a serenity that was entirely his own, looking up at the world from the first hour of his life with an expression of unhurried interest. The house was full, and the land was good, and the creek ran all through the year, which was not guaranteed in that country, and was a blessing they did not take for granted. Hector Ruiz's children and the Easton children grew up running the same ground and swimming in the same creek holes, and learning from the same 2 women who taught them that the land rewarded those who paid attention to it and treated it with care. The town of Redemption Creek grew slowly through those years, as Texas towns did in the 1880s, adding a new street and a small hotel and a proper doctor's office when Clarence Peale finally retired, and a younger man came down from Austin to take his place. The new doctor was a methodical, quiet man named Henry Voss who had opinions about sanitation and was generally right about them, and who asked better questions and made fewer assumptions, and who, in his first year of practice, consulted Ella Hawkins Easton on the subject of the women and families he was coming to know in the county, because she knew them all and knew them well. Stephen watched his wife become one of the people the town turned to, not for official reasons but for the reasons that matter more than official ones, because she was reliable and honest and sharp and caring, and had no agenda except the actual welfare of the people she cared about. She was not soft in her caring. She never had been, but she was genuine, and in the long run genuine outlasted soft by a considerable distance. On a Sunday morning in October of 1885, 7 years to the month from that April when Stephen had ridden into Redemption Creek, he sat in the third pew of the white church with Ella beside him and Daniel on his left and Clara, and little William between Ella and the end of the pew. And Reverend Albright delivered a service about providence and patience, and the particular way that the good things in life tended to arrive at their own pace, regardless of human planning, which may or may not have been another sermon with specific inspiration. And Stephen looked along the pew at his family and thought that every word of it was true. Ella looked at him from the corner of her eye, and he looked back, and something passed between them that had no words but needed none. The entire 7 years of it, everything from the hoe on the porch to the cornfield, in May to the sunrise wedding to the noon revelation to Daniel's first certain cry and Clara's careful eyes and William's unhurried serenity, all of it, and where it had come from a rumor about a barren, broken woman that a man at a roadside inn had said with a shrug as though it were simply the weather, and from a man on a roan horse who had decided to find out for himself. The town of Redemption Creek sang the last hymn of the service, and Ella sang with it in her clear voice, and Daniel sang loudly and in approximately the right key, and Clara sang with precision because that was her way, and William leaned against his mother's arm and listened. The sunlight came through the church's 2 windows and lay warm and particular on all of them, and outside the creek ran in the October morning, and the fields were going gold with the season's end. After church, as they walked home along the river road with the children running ahead and the October light long and amber across the grass, Ella took Stephen's arm in that way she had, the easy claiming of it that she had never quite done in those early careful months, and that now was simply part of the grammar of their days together. "Gus Whatley told me this morning that he is thinking of running for the county council," she said. "Is he?" Stephen said. "He asked my opinion of his chances," she said. Stephen glanced at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him he had good organizational instincts and poor listening habits, and that if he could address the second one the first would carry him a long way," she said. "And what did he say to that?" "He said I was probably right," she said, "which is itself an improvement in the listening habits." Stephen laughed, and it carried out into the October air over the creek and the fields, and Ella tipped her head back in the afternoon light and laughed with him, and the sound of it went a long way, which was fitting, because it was the sound of something that had been found and kept and built into something lasting, something that the whole of Redemption Creek had eventually learned to recognize for what it was, which was simply the truth of 2 people who had been lucky enough to find each other and wise enough to know it. The children ran ahead along the river road, Daniel in the lead as always, Clara deliberate and steady behind him, little William trotting to keep up with his short, determined legs, and above them the Texas sky was the particular deep blue of an October afternoon, and the creek said its perpetual thing to the stones, and the homestead waited for them at the end of the road, solid and warm and entirely theirs. Ella Easton, who had been told she was barren and broken, walked home with her husband's arm under her hand, and her 3 children in front of her and her life, full to the edges of everything that had once been withheld from her. And the morning had been there since the day they married at sunrise, and the fools had been named by noon, and the years since had been the proof of every good thing Stephen Easton had believed about the woman on the porch with the hoe, and the thing that mattered most, the thing that made all of it make sense, was simply this: He had not believed in her because she had given him reason to. He had believed in her because he had looked, really looked, and seen what was actually there. And she had believed in herself because he had shown her how. And together, they had made something from that seeing, and that believing that not a single shrug in a roadside inn could have predicted, something the whole of Redemption Creek had eventually had to reckon with, something that stood in the golden October afternoon as undeniable as the land they had worked, and the children they were raising, and the life they had built morning by morning, season by season, in the only way that anything real is ever built, which is one careful, true, committed day at a time.